At Atlanta's Central train station, the holiday rush filled every platform and hallway like a river swollen with too much rain. Laughter, footsteps, loudspeaker announcements, and the muted drag of suitcases created a constant hum, a soundscape of human migration at its most frantic. It was the kind of chaos that could make a man feel invisible even when pressed shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 strangers. Joshua Miller moved through the crowd with Lexi, his veteran Labrador retriever, at his side. Their steps were slow but purposeful, weaving patterns among hurried travelers. Joshua's uniform drew little attention. Most people look through authority figures these days, too distracted by schedules, screens, and their own carefully managed worries. Lexi's harness, labeled boldly with the word K9 unit, shifted slightly with each movement, her black coat gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It had been 3 years since Joshua had left active duty. The city beat was different from foreign deployments, but in some ways lonelier. The camaraderie was thinner here, dissolved into nods and clipped radio chatter. He carried the quiet ache of missing something he couldn't quite name anymore, perhaps a sense of being needed beyond the limits of protocol and clocked shifts. The station itself was a living organism today, throbbing with anticipation and exhaustion. People clutched steaming cups of coffee, clung to worn duffels, adjusted heavy scarves. The smell of pretzels, engine grease, and cold air mixed into a pungent reminder of transit. The glass ceiling high above let in a weak winter light, diffused and cold like the inside of a snow globe. Lexi, steady and reliable, matched Joshua's pace exactly. She was getting older now. He noticed it in the slower wag of her tail and the occasional stiffness in her legs when the days ran too long. Yet today, her senses were sharp, her head on a swivel, scanning faces and scents with unyielding diligence. The patrol had been uneventful so far. A lost child reunited with frantic parents. A man who had one too many drinks quietly guided away from the platform edge. Just another day keeping the tides of humanity moving safely. Then, without any visible cue, Lexi tensed. Joshua felt it first through the leash, a vibration, like a live wire suddenly strung tight. Lexi's body lowered into a subtle crouch, muscles locked. Her ears pinned back, her nose pointed like a compass needle toward a single figure standing near the central information desk. It was a young woman, visibly pregnant, her coat too thin for the bitter chill that crept through the station. Her hands were wrapped protectively around her belly, fingers gripping the fabric like she could hold herself together through sheer will. Her face was pale, framed by dark, unwashed hair tucked into a loose bun. The cheap suitcase beside her had scuff marks on every corner, its zipper patched with electrical tape. Lexi growled, a low, urgent sound rarely heard from her, reserved only for serious threat detection. Instantly, the people nearby reacted. Conversation stumbled into awkward silence. Travelers shifted away, whispering behind raised hands. Someone pulled a child closer by the sleeve. The woman, Sammy Harper, according to the weathered ID she produced when asked, looked bewildered but said nothing defensive. She only tightened her arms around her belly, eyes flickering with the brief, haunted look of someone too tired to explain herself again. Standard procedure kicked in, clinical and practiced. Joshua and 2 nearby officers began a thorough sweep. Her suitcase was emptied on a stainless steel table. Crumpled clothes, a battered paperback novel, a half-eaten granola bar. Her purse revealed nothing more than a cracked phone, a nearly expired driver's license, and a bus ticket folded neatly into the back pocket. Nothing illegal. Nothing dangerous. Yet Lexi remained frozen, her nose hovering just inches from Sammy's abdomen, her body still humming with that same fierce, protective energy. Joshua frowned. He could already feel the irritation radiating from his colleagues. One of them shook his head suddenly, murmuring about wasting time. Another **T him a look that said this isn't protocol. Protocol would have meant clearing Sammy and sending her on her way with a polite apology. But Joshua didn't move. The leash in his hand vibrated again, Lexi's way of insisting without words. He thought about the stories whispered during K9 training seminars, the dog that found a woman's breast cancer before doctors did. The one that stopped a jogger mid-run just days before his undiagnosed aneurysm burst. Science hadn't caught up with instinct yet, but Joshua had seen enough to trust what could not be explained. A lump of anxiety formed in his gut. He stepped away from the other officers and radioed for medical assistance, his voice low and steady to avoid alarming Sammy further. A few nearby passengers, sensing something serious, edged closer, curiosity outweighing caution. Sammy sat on the bench as instructed, one hand still bracing her stomach, the other gripping the bench so hard her knuckles turned white. She insisted she felt fine. Maybe a little tired. Maybe a little dizzy, but nothing alarming. Joshua nodded gently but kept Lexi positioned close to her side, watching. Minutes later, the station's contracted paramedics arrived, carrying bags heavy with equipment. They set to work with calm efficiency, checking vitals, running a portable ultrasound. At first, everything seemed stable. The tension in the air began to loosen. Then the monitors beeped, a sharp sound that cut through the low murmur of the station. Sammy's blood pressure had dropped dangerously. The portable ultrasound tech frowned, adjusting the probe over Sammy's abdomen. Within seconds, the diagnosis was made, a partial placental abruption. Internal bleeding. The baby's life, and Sammy's, were hanging by a thread. The paramedics exchanged quick, practiced glances before springing into action. A gurney appeared, straps clicked, a rapid but careful transfer. Oxygen mask placed. 4 fluid started. Commands issued into radios for an emergency ambulance transport to Grady Memorial. Joshua stood back, heart pounding, the radio chatter crackling in his ear as Lexi leaned against his leg. Around them, the once curious crowd shifted uncomfortably, realizing the gravity of what had almost gone unseen. Had Lexi not stopped them, Sammy would have boarded her train. She would have collapsed en route, maybe somewhere between here and her brother's home hours away, too far from help. There would have been no one to catch her fall. Joshua knelt and ran a hand along Lexi's back, feeling the strong beat of her heart beneath his fingers. His other hand still held the leash, but it wasn't a leash anymore, it was a lifeline, connecting past training, pure instinct, and a moment of courage to override the manual. Sometimes, he realized, the real danger wasn't in breaking the rules. It was in not listening when the silence spoke louder than words. The ambulance's wail faded into the distance, leaving a hollow quiet in its place. Around the information desk, the holiday crowd hesitated, pulled between the instinct to move on and the human urge to understand what they had just witnessed. Some turned back to their itineraries, heads down, the event already filing itself away as a strange memory. Others lingered a little longer, exchanging low murmurs, as if trying to reconcile the image of a pregnant woman, a dog, and a police officer with the swirling rush of their own journeys. Joshua stood still in the middle of it all, the collar of his uniform jacket brushing against his chin with each shallow breath. Lexi sat obediently by his side, her body finally relaxing now that the danger had passed. Her gray-flecked muzzle lifted slightly, sensing the shift in her partner's energy. Despite the adrenaline still coursing through him, Joshua felt a heavy weariness settle into his bones. He could already predict the questions waiting for him back at the precinct, the paperwork, the report reviews, the subtle undercurrent of doubt from superiors who valued adherence to procedure over the messy uncertainty of human instinct. He could hear the whispered critiques forming, overstepped his role, delayed operations, created unnecessary disruption. And yet, the alternative haunted him far more. He imagined Sammy alone on a train seat, bleeding silently, strangers too distracted or too afraid to intervene until it was too late. He pictured Lexi back at the station, restless, whimpering, sensing the outcome she had tried so desperately to warn against. That image rooted him where he stood, grounding him in a certainty that no reprimand could shake. As Joshua clipped Lexi's leash back onto her harness, a station manager in a rumpled blazer approached him, clipboard clutched like a shield against the chaos of the day. "Officer Miller," the man began, his voice uncertain, "there's a bit of commotion now. Passengers are concerned. Media's already sniffing around. Was it a security threat?" Joshua met the man's eyes, calm and steady. "Medical emergency." "Resolved." The manager hesitated, clearly wanting more but unwilling to press a uniformed officer. After a moment, he nodded briskly and retreated back toward his post, barking orders into a walkie-talkie. Joshua turned his attention back to the concourse. A few people were still watching him. A woman clutching a toddler gave him a small nod of gratitude. An older man tipped his hat. A teenager nearby, phone in hand, appeared to be uploading footage of the incident to social media. The ripples had already ****, spreading outward into the wider world in ways Joshua couldn't control. He wasn't looking for recognition. He was looking for reassurance that instinct, quiet, unglamorous, often invisible, still mattered. That night, back at the station's small K-9 unit headquarters, Joshua unbuckled Lexi's harness and brushed her down with a worn bristle brush. The room smelled faintly of leather, coffee, and the familiar musk of working dogs. Lexi leaned into the brush strokes, her tail thumping softly against the tiled floor. On the table nearby sat a preliminary incident report, a thick stack of forms Joshua would need to complete. He knew the words he would have to use: observed canine alert, initiated secondary screening, medical intervention requested, subject transported. Sterile phrases that stripped away the raw humanity of the moment. No box to check for trusted the dog more than the process. He paused, his hand resting lightly on Lexi's broad back. For a second, he allowed himself to simply breathe. In another part of the city, under the sterile buzz of hospital lights, Sammy Harper was alive. Her baby, tiny, fragile, and new to the world, was alive. That was enough. The next morning, the news broke. It started small, a local station running a segment titled K-9 Officer's Instinct Saves Pregnant Woman at Train Station. Grainy footage from a teenager's phone showed Lexi freezing in front of Sammy, Joshua's calm voice asking for medical backup, paramedics swarming the scene. Then larger outlets picked up the story. The national morning shows. Online news aggregators. By noon, Joshua's inbox was flooded with media requests. His commanding officer summoned him into a tense meeting, both congratulating and chastising him in the same breath. "You did good work," the captain said gruffly, tapping a finger against a printed copy of the news article. "But next time, clear it higher before going off script." Joshua nodded, offering no defense. He understood the dance. Public praise, private reprimand. It was part of the uniform as much as the badge. Later that afternoon, an unexpected call came through the station's main line. A nurse from Grady Memorial left a message. Sammy Harper would like to invite Officer Miller and his K-9 partner to visit her and her newborn daughter when they're stable. She says she owes her life to your dog. Joshua sat with the message for a long time, staring at the blinking voicemail light. Around him, the station hummed with the usual background noise, typing, muted conversations, the occasional burst of static from a police radio. Finally, he scratched behind Lexi's ear and said quietly into the room, "Looks like you've been promoted, girl." Lexi licked his hand, blissfully unaware of titles or accolades. To her, the world was simple: stay close, stay alert, protect. When Joshua and Lexi arrived at the hospital the next day, it was pouring rain. The streets outside glistened with puddles, reflecting the red and blue lights of emergency vehicles parked in the loading bay. Inside, Sammy was resting in a modest room on the maternity floor. Her face was pale but peaceful, cradling a tiny, swaddled bundle in her arms. The baby's skin was translucent, her hands no bigger than a thumbprint. Sammy looked up when they entered. Tears immediately welled in her tired eyes. She struggled to sit upright, the four tugging at her wrist. "You saved us," she said hoarsely, her voice cracking. "Both of you." Joshua hesitated, the practiced professionalism of his role crumbling under the raw emotion of the moment. Sammy reached toward the bassinet beside her, shifting the baby into its narrow confines, then patted the bed as an invitation. As Joshua sat awkwardly in the plastic chair, Lexi pressed her head against Sammy's outstretched hand. The young mother smiled, stroking Lexi's silky ears with trembling fingers. "I named her Avery," Sammy whispered. "After my brother. He thought I was dead, but now she's proof I'm not." She paused, gathering courage. "I don't have many people. I was wondering, would you, her voice broke, but she steadied it. Would you be Avery's godfather? Joshua blinked, stunned. The word hung in the air, delicate and full of weight. A lifetime of duty, of following orders and rules, had not prepared him for this kind of honor, the kind freely given, not earned through rank or service. He looked at Lexi, whose tail thumped softly against the floor, then back at Sammy and the tiny life wrapped in hospital-issued cotton. Joshua placed his hand gently over Sammy's. His voice, when it came, was rough with emotion. Yes, he said simply. There were no medals for this. No commendations. Only a rain-soaked memory of a crowded station, a dog who had listened to something deeper than sight or smell, and a young mother's quiet gift of trust. In that small room, under the thin hum of hospital machines, a new bond was formed, unwritten, unbreakable. And outside the hospital window, the rain kept falling, like a blessing whispered on the glass. The world, it seemed, had an endless appetite for stories of quiet heroism, even if it often forgot the heroes themselves once the headlines faded. For days after Joshua's visit to the hospital, the story spread like ripples across a pond. First small local blogs picked it up, then larger news outlets. Before long, it was everywhere, on morning talk shows, social media feeds, even whispered about in elevators and train cars across the city. Footage of Lexi halting in the middle of the crowded station replayed again and again, her focus pure, her determination unwavering. The camera often panned to Joshua's still form, standing steady by her side, embodying a kind of trust that was rarely seen, let alone celebrated. A few news outlets dubbed them the Guardians of Gate 7. Joshua found it strange, even uncomfortable, to be recognized by strangers. Some would approach him hesitantly during patrols, mothers with strollers, older men in worn baseball caps, young professionals with shy smiles, and offer quiet thanks. It wasn't the attention that unsettled him. It was the idea that doing what felt simply right was seen as extraordinary. At the precinct, reactions were mixed. Some officers clapped him on the back and teased him about becoming famous, but there were undercurrents he couldn't ignore. A few senior officials murmured about the danger of officers acting on gut instinct instead of strict procedure. Protocol was the shield they lived behind, and Joshua's deviation, no matter how justified, felt threatening to some. He tried not to dwell on it. The bond he shared with Lexi mattered more. Her trust, her alert that had saved 2 lives, that was real. Still, an invisible line seemed to grow between him and some colleagues. It didn't bother him. Not really. He had lived most of his life on the quiet side of admiration, never needing the noisy applause of crowds. 2 weeks after the event, as Christmas lights began to appear in windows and along street lamps, a summons arrived at the station. The mayor's office. A formal ceremony, the letter explained. In recognition of service beyond the call of duty. Joshua stared at the thick cream-colored envelope in his hands. He didn't move for a long time. Lexi, sensing his unease, pressed her head into his thigh. When the day of the ceremony arrived, Joshua wore his dress uniform for the first time in years. The fabric felt stiff at the shoulders, unfamiliar. His medals, quiet tokens of years spent far from home, caught the winter light filtering through the courthouse windows. Lexi wore a freshly brushed coat and a new leather harness polished until it shone. The grand hall was filled beyond capacity. Reporters lined the back walls, notebooks poised. Families filled the seats, mothers bouncing toddlers on their knees, elderly veterans adjusting their caps, teenagers scrolling through their phones, pretending not to be excited. Joshua stood at the edge of the platform, Lexi seated at his heel. The mayor, a tall woman with silver streaks in her hair and a reputation for fierce integrity, took the podium. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked out across the gathered faces, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she began. Most acts of courage are invisible, she said, her voice carrying in the high-ceilinged hall. They do not come with fanfare. They are not caught on camera. They are quiet decisions made in moments when following the rules would be easier than following the heart. She paused, her eyes resting on Joshua. Officer Joshua Miller and his K-9 partner, Lexi, chose the harder path. They trusted instinct over bureaucracy. They placed compassion above convenience. And because of that choice, 2 lives were saved. The crowd murmured, a ripple of emotion moving like a soft breeze across the room. Joshua shifted uncomfortably but remained still. Lexi leaned gently against his leg, her warm weight a steady reassurance. The mayor stepped down from the podium. She carried something small and heavy in her hands, a plaque framed in dark oak. Etched into it were simple words. In trust we serve, for acts of courage beyond duty, December 24th. Beneath the inscription, 2 names, Officer Joshua Miller and K-9 Lexi. The mayor placed it carefully in Joshua's hands. She offered a crisp salute. Joshua returned it, his chest tightening unexpectedly. The applause was not thunderous. It was not wild. It was quiet, steadfast, like a heartbeat made audible. Among the crowd, Joshua noticed familiar faces. The teenage boy who had filmed the original footage stood near the back, now wearing a suit a size too big. A woman who had witnessed the incident at the station wiped tears from her eyes with a crumpled tissue. 2 men in maintenance uniforms who worked at the station stood side by side, their arms crossed, nodding with solemn pride. And at the very back, half hidden behind a marble pillar, was Sammy Harper. She held baby Avery against her chest, the tiny infant wrapped snugly in a knitted blanket. Sammy's eyes met Joshua's across the distance, and she gave him a small, tremulous smile. Joshua inclined his head in acknowledgement, his throat too tight to speak. When the ceremony ended, and the crowd began to drift away into the brittle December afternoon, Joshua stayed behind. He ran his fingers lightly over the engraved letters, tracing the words not as a hero, but as a man who had simply listened when something deep inside insisted, look closer. Stay longer. Care more. As he stood there, Lexi sitting faithfully at his side, the mayor approached once more. We're planning to start a new initiative, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no reporters were listening. A community trust program. Officers trained not just to enforce, but to notice. To listen beyond protocol. She smiled faintly. We'd like you to help lead it. Joshua didn't answer right away. He looked down at Lexi, whose tired eyes blinked up at him with infinite patience. He thought about all the places he had served. The borders he had patrolled. The battles he had fought. This quiet work of noticing the unnoticed, believing the unbelievable, trusting instinct when rules fell short, felt bigger than all of them. He turned back to the mayor, the weight of the plaque solid in his hands. I'd be honored, he said. Outside, the sky was soft with gathering dusk. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the courthouse windows, landing soundlessly on the stone steps below. The world, with all its noise and rush and forgetting, moved on. But in that quiet, fleeting moment, one simple truth remained unshaken. Kindness without question is enough. Winter faded slowly into spring, and with it, the rhythms of the station changed. The crowds thinned, the heavy coats disappeared, and the air inside the terminal turned lighter, touched with the scent of thawing earth carried in from the city's waking streets. Joshua and Lexi still patrolled, but their paths now carried a different weight. Travelers who once passed without a glance now nodded in recognition. Children knelt to pet Lexi when off-duty hours allowed it. Retired veterans made a point to shake Joshua's hand, pressing folded newspaper clippings into his palm like talismans. Lexi's photo, taken at the exact moment of her alert, had been framed and placed in the station's main hallway, a quiet memorial to a decision made without hesitation. The plaque from the mayor's office found a place above Joshua's desk, though he never pointed it out to visitors. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. In late March, during a routine vet checkup, the news Joshua had quietly dreaded arrived. Lexi's hips were beginning to fail her, common for aging working dogs. She was slowing down, her once endless stamina flickering like a candle nearing its end. The department offered him a choice. Lexi could be retired into a specialized K-9 foster program where former handlers often didn't have the space, or the means, to take their partners home. Joshua didn't hesitate. He signed the papers that same afternoon, folding Lexi's leash into his jacket pocket with reverence. No more cold floors, no more endless patrols. Her days of service, of sacrifice, were over. She would spend the rest of her life exactly as she deserved, safe, warm, surrounded by love. They moved into a small house on the edge of the city, a place with a worn porch swing and enough backyard for a slow chase after falling leaves. Joshua adapted easily to the new rhythm. Morning walks shortened to gentle strolls. Evening patrols were replaced by cups of coffee on the porch, Lexi's head resting against his knee. Sometimes, at night, when the world outside blurred into a quiet hum, Joshua would run his fingers through Lexi's fur and think about the day she stopped the world with a single growl. How that simple, instinctive act had threaded together so many lives, Sammy's, Avery's, his own, into a tapestry stronger than rules or plans could ever weave. Sammy visited often, carrying Avery in her arms. The little girl grew quickly, her giggles brightening the house like sunlight through an open window. She called Joshua Uncle Josh and tugged delightedly on Lexi's ears, the dog enduring the attention with patient, dignified tolerance. On the anniversary of that winter day at the station, Sammy arrived with a small package. Inside was a photograph. Joshua, Lexi, Sammy, and Avery, all captured under the soft golden haze of a spring sunset, standing together on the front porch. Framed beneath the photo, simple words had been etched. Because you listened. Joshua hung it beside Lexi's old service harness. Years later, after Lexi's paws no longer left prints in the backyard snow, after Avery grew tall enough to run races without tripping over her own feet, Joshua still walked the station corridors sometimes, tracing the old routes. He would pause near Gate 7, letting the memories brush against him like warm wind, no crowds, no ceremony. Just a silent promise still alive in his bones. To notice the unnoticed. To act when instinct called. To believe that kindness, unasked and unmeasured, was always enough. And though the world hurried by, loud and distracted, Joshua carried the quiet forward, one unseen act at a time. Because in the end, the quiet ones changed everything.